Okay, we can start now. Good morning to all of you. I would like to thank you in front of SELA for joining us today. We are very happy to have you all here, and we truly hope that you will find this webinar useful. For those of you who are not familiar with the SELA, SELA Southeast Legal Alliance is a network of independent law firms that works together to provide seamless legal support across Southeast Europe. Today's webinar will be hosted by Pencho Stanchev, partner from Dimitrov Petrov & Co., Bulgarian SELA member firm. He has extensive experience for more than 20 years in energy law, in dispute resolution, and banking. He represents a significant number of market players from energy industry. He will be accompanied by Davorin Marinkovic and Milica Pešteric. Davorin is partner from Dimitrijević and Partners, Bosnian SELA member. He has extensive experience in infrastructure and energy law. He is highly experienced in PPPs, concessions, and public procurement. Milica is a senior associate at BD2P, Serbian SELA member. She's a key member of the team in Energy and Infrastructure Department. She's an active member of the Serbian Energy Law Association. Finally, we also have a guest speaker from UK, Mr. Andrew Renton, partner from Castletown Law. Andrew is a leading solicitor in the energy and infrastructure industry. He works in the UK and internationally as well in the Middle East and Central Europe. He will give us a valuable insight into his expertise in energy field. I now give the word to Pencho, and I encourage you to share your impressions during the presentations, and please, when it comes to questions, ask them at the Q&A part. Pencho, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ivana. Thank you everyone for attending this webinar. My presentation will focus on the challenges that the developers of renewable energy projects are facing in Bulgaria. With the spike of energy prices, the interest in renewable energy projects in the region is booming. Currently, there are no feed-in tariffs or other substantial governmental support schemes, but the spike of the prices is enough to drive the sector forward, and we are receiving new inquiries of developers almost every week. Most of the investors currently focus on solar and the wind, but mostly solar, because in Bulgaria, actually the weather conditions are very appropriate for such type of projects. The sunrise is almost identical in the entire country. With regard to the legal framework, the hot topic is the expected transposition of the new directive on the promotion of the use of energy from renewable sources. It sets a EU target for 32% share of renewable energy in the total energy mix of the Union by 2030. One of the main focuses of the directive is the simplification of the administrative procedures as an incentive for the developers to invest in such type of projects. Bulgaria has not transposed the directive yet, although the deadline has expired in June 2021. But now we have a brand new bill for amendment of the Energy from Renewable Sources Act, which has just been made available for public consultations and is expected to be adopted soon. The main reason for the delayed transposition is the political crisis here, because we didn't have working parliament for a long time, and now it's still not clear whether we have a regular government in the next few months. But we hope that the directive will be adopted, because it will ease the process of investment in such projects a lot. As for the main challenges that the developers of renewable projects are facing now, the main challenges are the legislative challenges. To me, the regulatory framework often falls behind the new technologies and the actual business investment intentions. The administrative procedures currently are lengthy, complicated, and must be simplified. Surprisingly to me, the financing of renewable projects also turns out to be quite a challenge these days, because recently most of the banks are not eager to invest in and support such projects. They have a lot of requirements to the investors, for example, to the equipment, to the EPC developers, and so on. And the most important part is that they require fixed and predictable income in order to grant a loan. Of course, the connection to the grid is also a challenge. As in every jurisdiction, the capacity is limited, and due to the huge interest in renewable projects, actually the currently pending applications are more than enough to fill the remaining capacity of the grid, and it needs to be reconstructed and developed further in order to allow connection of all the pending projects. As for the legislative challenges, I could give you two brief examples in order to illustrate the problems we face. For example, in order to apply for construction license and connection to the grid, the developer should hold title or construction right over the land. This means that structure of the financing and investment, which is really popular in other jurisdictions, is not possible in Bulgaria. This popular structure is actually based on long-term lease agreements, so that the developer just rents the land without buying it when applying for the necessary permits. Unfortunately, this is not currently possible in Bulgaria. It was allowed 3 years ago only for small rooftop installations below 30 kilowatts. But for the big investors, so they have to acquire the land or limited construction right in order to apply for most of the procedures. It's not entirely impossible to develop other structures. For example, that the developer uses a power of attorney issued by the owner of the land in order to go through the administrative procedures. But this complicates the transactions and create further risk for the developer, because there is always a risk that the owner will ultimately sell the land to someone else after the buyer has gone through all the procedures, which is really quite risky. Another example, currently there is no explicit legal framework in Bulgaria for development of floating PV projects. The interest in such type of projects currently is huge. There are a lot of investors exploring these options, but they have to rely on the existing legislation. But this creates quite uncertainty, because it's not certain how the administration will react. I've heard that, for example, the regional environment offices are creating problems to some investors who try to develop such floating PV systems. Although it's not explicitly forbidden to put solar systems on water, and it's even more efficient according to the experts. And there is no explicit framework, which is quite a challenge to convince the administration that such projects could work under the current legislation. As I have mentioned, currently the administrative procedures are quite burdensome for the investors. There are a lot of administrative procedures to be exhausted in order to obtain the necessary permits. And most of these procedures should be carried out before a different authority. For example, if the investor plans on developing the project on agricultural land, the developer should begin with a change of the designation of the purpose of the land and turn it into land suitable for construction. Of course, the environmental assessment procedures are also quite burdensome and take a lot of time. The next step is the amendment of the zoning plans, the general and the detailed development plans, which is necessary in order for the developer to be able to apply for connection to the grid and construction permit. The next procedure, of course, is the connection to the grid. Here, as I mentioned, the limited capacity is quite an issue. But not only that, and also the procedure is quite complicated and requires several steps. Filing an application by the developer, then issuance of opinion of the grid or distribution transmission operator on the conditions for connection, and then conclusion of preliminary connection agreement, and after the issuance of the construction permit, conclusion of final connection agreement. And this takes a lot of time and effort for the investors. The next steps is, of course, the approval of the investment design and the issuance of construction permit. This is a standard procedure, but it also takes a time, and it is carried out before a different authority, usually the chief architect of the respective municipality. After the construction of the power plant is complete, it should be also commissioned, which is also done by a different authority. And if the installed capacity of the project is over 5 megawatts, then the investor must also apply for a license issued by the Energy and Water Regulatory Commission for generation of electricity. Fortunately, the licensing procedure could be done prior to the construction of the power plant. This saves time, but it also could lead to further cost for the investor because there are annual fees for maintaining the license. And if actually the commissioning of the plant takes too long, this cost will be in vain for the investor. The strange thing here is that identical administrative procedures apply to projects of different type and scope, regardless of whether the project is for 5 megawatts or for 100 megawatts. The procedure is basically the same, which is really strange. And in my opinion, there should be simplified procedures for smaller projects. Currently, the pending applications for connection to the grid are for installed capacity of over 24 gigawatts, according to data published by the Bulgarian transmission system operator in August this year. This is, as the grid transmission operator mentioned, this is critical for the grid. And it needs to be developed further in order to be able to allow connection of all the projects. Therefore, the transmission system operator is currently discussing with the developers and the Minister of Energy a plan to allow for a faster development of the grid in order to allow realization of all the renewables project. But we will see where this will lead. A problem here is that a lot of these projects, which are currently applied for connection to the grid, will never happen. Therefore, the transmission system operator stressed that there should be a mechanism to distinguish real investors from speculators who just apply for connection in order to block capacity of the grid and then try to sell the product to someone else or just blackmail competitors. One of the mechanisms which are currently discussed is requirement for a bank guarantee in favor of the operator, which is lost if the project is not realized within the deadline provided in the connection contract. And this could work, and the bank guarantee could be based on the installed capacity. But this is currently an idea and it's not realized yet. As I have mentioned, currently the process for connection of the grid requires several steps. This could also be simplified, and only one application could be filed and directly a connection contract could be executed rather than going through all these preliminary stages. As a standard practice, the operator of the grid usually reassigns the engineering and the construction of the connection facilities to the applicant, and afterwards buys the facilities based on the costs made by the developer. This saves time and it's a good practice. As for the new Bill for Amendment of the Energy from Renewable Sources Act, which is currently available for public consultation and is expected to be voted by the Parliament soon, it introduces some of the ideas of the directive, which will ease the burden of the administrative procedures. For example, one of the most important amendments is the introduction of a single contact point with the administration, administrative services centers at the respective municipalities. The purpose of these administrative services centers is to coordinate the issuance of the construction permit with the chief architect of the municipality and also coordinate the connection to the grid with the transmission or the distribution system operator. The term for connection cannot be more than 2 years, and it could be extended only in case of some special circumstances. Also, the Minister of Energy and the Minister of Environment, according to the bill, shall jointly develop a plan of the preferred areas for each type of renewable technology, prioritizing lands with bad quality on one hand and excluding protected areas on the other. The plan is yet to be drafted after the bill is finally adopted by the Parliament, but such a plan will ease the developers a lot by allowing them to focus on such areas rather than investing in plots which are not acceptable from environmental perspective. Also, another important measure to ease the investment process is that the Sustainable Energy Development Agency will develop a guidebook on the procedures for construction and reconstruction of renewable power plants. This guide will be made available through the administrative services centers at the municipalities, and the developers could use this guide in order to navigate through the complicated administrative procedures. The bill also provides for a simplified procedure for change of the designation of the agricultural lands, but unfortunately we do not have much details, and probably this will be implemented through another legislative amendment to the agricultural lands legislation. As for the connection to the grid, the new bill provides that the developers could enter a contract for connection to the grid before issuance of the construction permit for the power plant against payment of part of the connection fee or a bank guarantee. In this way, the operator could start expanding and reconstruction of its facilities as early as possible in order to allow for the connection of the power plant. Another key amendment is that the grid operators will be obliged to develop and implement web-based system containing information on the active connection contracts. Currently, it's not clear whether this system will be public and who will have access to it, but it should make things more predictable for the investors. The next important change is that the grid operators will organize auctions each year for reserving of grid connection capacities. This will allow the developers to reserve for their capacity prior to deciding on the investment and spending a lot of money on acquisition of a land and other procedures, and avoid a negative outcome due to lack of free available capacity. Of course, there are some other ideas for further legislative amendments. As I mentioned, there is a lot of interest in photovoltaic floating power plants. And it is reasonable for the legislation to provide for explicit legal regime for such projects. Further simplification of the administrative procedures is also possible, in my opinion. For example, no environmental impact assessment should be required for areas determined as preferred areas for the specific type of technology in the plan developed by the Minister of Energy and the Minister of Environment, which I have mentioned. There could also be simplified procedures for amendment of the detailed development plan, and simplified procedure for issuance of construction permits, especially for solar projects, which are quite simple. And also another idea is that the lessors under long-term lease agreements could also apply for connection to the grid and construction permit. Currently, this is possible only for small rooftop installations, but I see no reasonable arguments that this should not be possible also for bigger projects. And finally, I want to say a few words about the financing challenges. Currently, the financing banks have a lot of specific requirements regarding the manufacturer of the equipment and the EPC contractor. This should also be considered when planning the investment by the developer. But the biggest challenge right now is that most of the banks require predictable income in order to grant financing. If it is not possible to have a long-term PPA with a fixed price, which currently is quite a challenge considering the volatile markets, the same effect could be achieved through contracts for differences, and we have used this structure for a lot of transactions. Under this contract for differences, the parties agree on a referent price of per megawatt, which is usually linked to the average price on a specific segment of energy market exchange. For example, for Bulgaria, we usually use the market segments of the independent Bulgarian energy exchange, IBEX. If the actual market price is lower, then the buyer pays difference the other way around. If the actual market price is higher, the seller pays the difference to the buyer. In this way, both parties achieve the same business effect as with PPA with fixed prices. But there are no physical power deliveries under this type of contracts, and this could be used by the developers in order to demonstrate fixed income and predictable income from their sales to the bank in order to receive financing. So this was for me. Thank you very much, and I hand the floor over to Davorin for the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pencho. As Jovana kindly introduced me at the beginning, I'm Davorin Marinkovic from Dimitrievich Partners, and I'm head of our energy and infrastructure practice. In past several years, we've been working a lot on the renewables. And just for your information, to give you some basic background about the carbonization in the country, because now it's a very popular topic. And just a second. Firstly, I like to tell a short story about when we speak about decarbonization. We have two ends, actually. Production, where it is related to renewables, and energy efficiency at the end on the consumption side. And when the decarbonization story started in this country, there was one comment from a high official saying, why should we save electricity? It's very cheap here. And that's the basic information for an investor, that the electricity in Bosnia is very cheap for the time being. Of course, it relates only to the local consumption, but luckily now you are free to sell it to the market and export it. And that's the second important information about Bosnia, that Bosnia is not exporter of the electricity. And in these days, that's very important. But you know, in Bosnia, at some point, it was so high, very high enthusiasm for the renewables. And there was general idea that only thing that will work in Bosnia is production of the electricity from renewables, that it will be our oil. We will be having no other industry but just production of the electricity. Of course, that was some 8 years ago. Not much happened in the meantime. We still need to work. Another also important background information for Bosnia, that coal still matters. Actually 60% of the electricity in Bosnia is produced from coal, from the large thermal power plants. But luckily, there is a huge potential for renewables, for hydro, wind, and solar. Wind and solar mostly at the southern part of the country, but hydropower plants can be, actually, there is potential throughout the country, the whole country, actually. And there are a number of projects in the pipeline working on the small power plants, but also some bigger capacities. Though in past 10 years, actually, the only new capacity that was built was a brand new state-of-the-art thermal power plant in Stenari, 300 megawatts. But we also hope that there will be large hydro projects in the meantime and wind projects. Speaking on decarbonization in general, from Bosnian perspective, that was something considered as a first world problem. Actually, nobody was caring about decarbonization because we thought it's just something that Europe need to deal with. We will continue to use coal and things like that. But at some point, the country joined the energy community, and of course, having considered the directive, some steps had to be taken actually to implement the directive and move towards renewables. So here we are today. What's new? Actually, new legislation. Actually, firstly, new attitude, because the governments in the country, and you have to be aware that the Bosnia is confederal state, having a number of sub-jurisdictions with their own powers related to the electricity and energy in general. So all the governments actually at some point decided that we need to do something and that we need new investments in renewables. And that's how the enthusiasm I mentioned earlier was created. Now, these days, there is new legislation on the renewable energy sources. Actually, one part of the country, it was enacted early this year, and in another part of the country, it will be probably introduced by the end of this year. And it brings some new moments actually in local renewables markets, such as it's new moments for the market, but also for us lawyers to learn some new things and new stuff about the energy. So like prosumers, I'm sure you are aware of this. Then actually introduction of the energy cooperatives as a model for renewable energy sources, and how to promote renewable energy amongst the general population. Then we are moving also to premium auctions as a new model to actually provide subsidies for renewables, and that's some novelty comparing to previous feed-in tariffs and other subsidies. There's also new initiatives like providing photovoltaic solar panels for household and things like that that is supported by the government, but we will see how it will go. And of course, new investments, and there is significant interest for new wind farms and photovoltaics in the country. And luckily for us lawyers, there is a lot of potential investors that are coming in the country and asking for a guidance and also asking about the challenges, which is actually the topic we are discussing today. So, I already mentioned this is complex state with numbers of sub-jurisdictions in the country, and of course you can imagine how this permitting labyrinth look like. But in past 5 years, a lot has been done on the improvement of the regulatory framework for renewables, mostly through the technical assistance from USAID and German International Cooperation Agency. And luckily, I was a part of most of those projects working on the permitting, actually scrapping the barriers, administrative barriers for new investments in the renewables. When I started working on that, actually, there was enthusiasm that we will actually scrap all the permits needed for a project to be completed. But of course, at some point, you realize that there have to be some kind of permits, consents, approvals for in an energy sector. So basically, I won't be explaining you details of this. As I said, it differ at some point in different parts of the countries, but basic milestones are as usual. You will start with a concession granted by the government for developing of the energy facility. Next stop would be, of course, location conditions or urbanistic permit. After that, you have construction permit and use permit at the end, and between number of other things you have to resolve in the meantime, including the EIA study, ecology permit, water guidelines, connection, pre-connection, then connection, and so on. I believe it's common for more or less all jurisdictions. Yes, it takes time actually to go through this permitting labyrinth. The time for consents has been actually decreased, but it will take you a certain time, but as investors are all usually prepared for that. Speaking on challenges, I already explained the permits. Okay, guidance to administrative procedure is needed, and that's good. It's a good thing actually to have a lawyer. It worth every penny actually, because you need strong guidance through this labyrinth. And I said, it's been efficient now in comparison with the previous 5 years, but still you need to have, to follow all formal steps to achieve the construction point. Okay, as you heard from Pencho, land is one of the biggest challenges, but usually it's resolved on a way that the concessionaire gets the concession, and within the concession agreement, it gets the land. If the land is privately owned, then usually government would expropriate the land, but the investor will pay costs. In reality, it also happens that the investor will buy the land on its own, but that's more rarely. A lease agreement with private owners is also a possibility, but in my experience, nobody is interested for that. On the side of private owners, they are not interested for lease agreements. So usually the land is provided, given by the government for the period of the concession at the cost of the investor. Another big challenge, and the question that I'm quite often faced with is the grid, capacities of the grid. In Bosnia, everybody are scared about the grid connection. And you will have a number of permits. Connection agreement is at the very end of the procedure. You will have pre-consent, pre-agreement, and things like that. But the connection agreement is actually the point where an investor can be sure that it will get a connection. I mean, there is no guarantee before that. I mean, at least not formally introduced as a guarantee that you will get connection. In reality, nobody was turned down. Before connection agreement that comes at the end of the whole process, I mean, after construction actually of the facility, of course, investors feel uncomfortable until that point that they will get connection. As I said, nobody in reality was rejected for a connection approval. And before this connection agreement, you will have pre-consent, energy permit, and so on. So the only comfort I can give to investors, I usually say, okay, if you don't get a grid agreement at the connection agreement at the end of the process and you constructed the facility, you will take Bosnia and Herzegovina to the arbitration because there was an energy permit, a concession, and number of other documents guaranteeing you that you can build and use facility at the end of the process if you fulfill all the criteria. So that's the only remedy I can offer at this point. And of course, there has been a lot of plans, to extending capacities of the grid, of the network, since we have, a number of projects in the pipelines. So it's expected that the production from the renewables will be significantly increased in forthcoming years. Project financing, of course, I just mentioned wanted to mention low capacity of local banks, so you don't have to count on local banks, but investors coming abroad, okay, can introduce foreign bankers, and when it comes to the project financing, this jurisdiction actually can accommodate most of the features required for project financing. It is possible to have security instruments and so on. And the biggest facility I mentioned in past 10 years also was financed through the project financing and secured in all regular ways. So that's possible. That should not be an issue for investors. Luckily, there has been some success stories in lately, and three new wind farms constructed and actually started operating in past 2 years. Maybe 3 is not a huge number, but for this country it certainly is. It's some total capacity of this, I think, is 120 or 180 megawatts in total, which is not much, but there is a number of wind, hydro, and photovoltaic projects in different development phases throughout the country. There is almost, I think, 100 concessions for different projects. They are in different phases. Some are moving ahead, some are at the construction point already, and I know a number of those in the pipelines. At this moment, there is some 1,200 megawatts undergoing concession granting procedure, and that's just for the part of the country, actually, for Republic of Srpska at this very moment. So by the end of this year or by spring, we will have 1,200 megawatts of new projects under concessions, which is actually the starting point for the whole process. So we are keeping fingers crossed, actually, to move ahead with this. Okay, that's it from my side. I'm handing over now to Milica.
Hello. Good morning, everyone, once again. Thank you, Davorin. Well, I was probably lucky that my colleagues already said majority of my presentation, because obviously the situation is pretty much similar, no matter if the country is a EU member state or a candidate like us. But yeah, we are obviously facing the same or similar problems and challenges. I would definitely try to not to repeat what previous colleagues said, but just to underline a few points of what's new in renewable energy sources sector in Serbia. We've been waiting for years for the new regulatory framework, which finally was enacted last year. For the first time, we have separate renewable energy sources law. Obviously, it was recognized the importance of having such separate law and not to have this important topic within the general energy law or other regulation. This enactment of a new law was a part of a wider new laws that were enacted in energy field. So it wasn't only renewable energy sources, but also general energy legislation, energy efficiency also, and geological exploration and mining as well. So it was part of a wider legislative novelties involved. The new law introduced several new concepts and novelties. I would pay attention to prosumers. As Davorin said, prosumer is a known thing in other jurisdictions, but what I wanted to say about the prosumers in Serbia is actually became quite popular form within the industry and individuals. So far, we don't have one single residential building as a prosumer, although the law left this possibility as well. But we have the biggest prosumer already registered is one industrial plant which is up to 1 megawatt. That is, I would say, the most successful prosumer so far. It is interesting to follow the development of prosumer since it's introducing into the legal system up till now. The procedure for developing and registration of prosumer has been simplified to the maximum because the state and regulator recognize the importance of this concept and try to make the procedure as easy as possible for all of those people who and companies who are which are interested in this concept, because I think that the states recognize the importance of production of electricity from renewable resources, even on this smaller scale projects such as prosumers, because each megawatt of green energy or at this very moment energy at all is very important. So the production is significantly encouraged even in this form of prosumer. What I would also, what is interesting in this concept, the region of Vojvodina is having currently a pilot project of prosumer cadastre, because they plan in some municipality to try to develop this project and try to introduce this cadastre, so all interested people or companies can actually find out in advance the possibilities of developing prosumer in these municipalities. But as far as I know, the distribution system operator who's in charge of prosumer was a bit shocked by this initiative, because they were not informed about that, and they believe, of course, that they have to be an integral part of this project, because connection to the distribution system is very important, of course. What also was a kind of a challenge for prosumers is actually the payment of a price for those prosumers who are returning the electricity back to the grid, because payment actually of a VAT, because the VAT law, the energy bylaws were not in line, were not aligned actually with the VAT laws. So that was also kind of a problem. So although the concept faces many challenges while its first development, my impression is that is getting better and better, and I think that more and more entities, people will involve in this concept. The second novelty is definitely transfer from feed-in tariffs to feed-in premiums and auctions. And that sounded really amazing at the time we faced for the first time the new law. However, in practice, unfortunately, this concept failed because auctions never happened. The first auction is supposed to be happened by the end of last year. And the energy agency is supposed to set the maximal price for the auctions. However, for some reasons, using some methodology, no one is actually 100% aware what happened. But the energy agency actually set quite a low maximal price, having in mind the general situation on market and the very high prices and the prices of technology and the equipment for development of the plants. It was quite problematic for the prospective participants to participate in such auctions. So auctions failed. After that, new auctions were not even tried to be organized, because in the meantime we have technical government for months. So just recently we had the new Ministry of Energy and Mining, and we will see how that will continue. What is new initiative within this sector is actually corporate PPAs. Market participants are turning to this market concept and are less and less interesting in incentive measures that are actually envisaged by the new law, as these were envisaged by the previous laws as well. This is just the overview of the legislative framework in short. What we're still missing is bylaws referring to balancing, because I think also that market participants are still waiting for balancing to be regulated somehow, because currently the balancing responsibility is taken over by the public enterprise apps, Elektroprivreda Srbije, which is the electricity utility company, the state utility company, because they are a secured supplier. But that wouldn't be the case, because the balancing obviously needs to be regulated on the market principles, and for that we need definitely bylaws which would define in details the balancing, and of course the organization of intraday trading on the Southeast European Power Exchange SEPEX market in Serbia. So that's one of the things that investors and other developers are worried about. Further, I wouldn't spend much time on connection to the grid, because both of my colleagues actually expand on this in quite details. We are facing the same problems: capacity of grid, state in which the grid is at the moment, which needs really a serious reconstruction in order to continue accepting the new connections. And of course, the fact that each participant can apply for the connection to the grid without any particularly defined conditions, which leads to the fact that the grid capacity in certain let's say plot can be reserved by anyone, even those who are not serious developers. No security instruments are required for that, which would secure only those who are seriously developing a project to have that. This is because of the principle set out in the respective regulation, principle of non-discrimination and transparency, which allowed each and every application to be accepted. I would also refer to the financing of the renewable energy sources projects. Also, it was touched upon by my colleagues, but I just want to add that very few local banks actually are willing to finance these projects, particularly now when we don't have feed-in tariffs anymore, so they cannot measure the risk. This is their words, actually. They cannot measure the risk. They try to hedge it somehow, but even the auctions are not good enough for them as a type of incentive, not to mention the corporate PPAs, which is definitely, they cannot assess the bankability of the project in terms of market free market participation without incentives or some prices set in advance or expected in advance. Furthermore, we don't have developed practice in corporate PPAs. I don't think, except some small projects and the very bilateral relations between the participants, we don't have developed practice in concluding long-term PPAs, any kind of PPAs, not only the corporate PPAs. So this is quite confusing for the bank, particularly because the market, the global market, is also very, let's say, we cannot make clear expectations what is going to happen. So yeah, even the financing of a new project can be problematic. Also, before I just want to say one more thing before I turn to the permitting procedure. What was also problematic for the investor, it was a very low set maximal price, but also the two-direction principle of premiums, which was also not acceptable for the majority of investors, because they were risking to have the obligation for them to pay the difference between the prices to their purchaser. So they are really trying, the professional circles and professional organizations are negotiating with the state, with the regulator, with the state utilities companies, system operators, in order to find a solution, a common solution for everyone, because as the situation is now, investors are not actually interested in developments under these circumstances. Speaking of the permitting procedures, we don't have time, of course, to get through the whole procedure and to all phases of the procedure, but I would just underline that in the phase of regulating of real estate, of finding a place for development of the project, I can't underline any particular risks. This phase, according to our experience, goes quite smoothly. However, the phase which goes in parallel of spatial planning, documentation, or amending, changing of spatial plans if needed, that can be a challenging phase unless the developer has a very good local position or connections in the local municipalities, because the spatial plans are enacted by the local communities, the local municipality, and it's very important to coordinate successfully with them. So sometimes in practice, this can be a lengthy and challenging phase. At this phase, as I mentioned before, the developer is applying for the connection to the grid for the first time, and in that phase, that risk of having someone not that serious for development in your part of capacity is present, and currently there is no way that the developer decreases this risk, just to hope that by the end of the process, these not serious enough would on the way simply or naturally just be left over, and then further permitting, construction permit is for some time now a very regulated and effective procedure, one-stop shop. So I can't say that some significant problems should or expected to pop up in this phase. So I will skip it. Of course, the permitting procedure for renewable energy sources projects are rather complex and involves, as previous colleagues said, environmental impact assessment, water acts, a lot of documentation, but up until the phase of operational permit, I wouldn't emphasize anything in particular which may be problematic for the developer or cause project to stop. Operational permit is, of course, one important and challenging phase, after which, if it goes well, after which the energy license is obtained and a plant is ready for operations. I would not go into any further details. I would just like to point out some conclusions of that we as energy professionals in Serbia come up with in past period. The things that we should further work on. and try to solve in order to enable the new project to develop and generally to go forward and to fulfill the goals that we have and to fulfill conditions that we are taken with the energy community and the European Union. So the first thing is that regulated markets should be abounded in totally, of course, with a certain care of vulnerable purchasers, but definitely the prices should not be regulated at all. And this would enable the new investment and modernization or revitalization of the coal production and energy from coal, because as Dauri said, we still have a significant percentage of production of electricity from coal. Then introducing of intraday trading is really important, because that would solve balancing problems. And apparently, according to SEPEX, this should be done by the end of this year. In any time, I would say we can expect that. And then even the introducing of the carbon pricing, or a kind of an instrument of taxes for utilization of coal should be introduced. Maybe it's too ambitious to say that we can achieve this soon. However, at least to consider this possibility, as well as introducing the mechanism that when you're applying for the connection to the grid, that some security instrument is supposed to be provided, so to prove the serious position for further development of the project. Before I stop, I would just want to say one more thing about the financing of the project, because I've heard from previous colleagues that in the financing procedure, security instruments supposed to be provided. My experience with the local banks and the voices from them, they emphasize that even provision of the security instruments such as mortgage or pledges or receivables or whatever is usual security instruments commonly asked, required from the banks, are not good enough for them for this kind of projects, because they say, what can I do with the bunch of equipment, or as they say, a bunch of metal in the half and partially developed plant? If something goes wrong, there's nothing I can do with that. So yeah, it is quite challenging to pursue the bank to provide you the financing in terms of such a stable global electricity market with this local specific characteristics, such as a lack of long-term PPAs, which are not developed, and the abandonation of the feed-in tariffs, which for some reasons bank seems acceptable for in terms of risk assessment. So I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daurin and Milica. And it was really interesting to know that the situation is pretty much the same in Bulgaria as in Bosnia and Serbia. And now I'll give the floor to Andrew. He has some very interesting things to say about the general EU perspective. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay? Good. Morning, everyone, and thanks for inviting me along to speak today. What I want to do is just split what I'm going to say into two parts. One is taking us from where renewables started in Europe up to where we are now, and then look at what the impact of the REPowerEU presentation in the European Parliament was, and the European Commission was in May this year, and what that means looking forward, because I think it has implications across the whole of Europe for every energy participant, whether it's producer, consumer, or retailer. So, and as you all know, the the background is that the initial growth of renewables in Europe was quite slow because we were pretty arrogant about what we had already, and it was really Germany that led the way with the solar and onshore wind because they were probably greener in their view of the world than the rest of Europe, and that then began to gather pace. And as that became a commoditized commercial approach, governments then started to look at it across other parts of Western Europe, and that then allowed governments to say, well, the Germans managed to do this by a subsidized regime, so we can do the same. And that then led to a lot of growth. There was also, in Germany in particular, there's a lot of redundant land used for renewable development, and that happened also in other parts of Europe, particularly in the UK. There was a lot of redundant land used for onshore wind, particularly where hill land was often unused by farmers or landowners. And two things happened. One is they cut down a lot of trees to make room for hilltop wind, and then they used a lot of agricultural land, which historically was used for wild grazing for sheep, or in Scotland, where I come from, Highland cattle used to graze wild on hilltops. So that's all stopped now as a result of that. So there's some adverse impacts, but generally it was all seen as a good thing, and the government subsidised these in the UK particularly subsidised these projects very significantly, and that feed-in tariff approach became the prevalent method of governments enticing people into projects. When this feed-in tariff became, I think, as Melissa was saying, an acceptable basis for financing to see the risk mitigation, because there was a government payment sitting behind it. So everyone was pretty sure that if the government was backing a project, the project was going to succeed because they would be able to get the funders and financial industry behind it. But as the projects grew, grid network issues from resilience and intermittency, local network issues particularly, began to emerge. And that then led to people looking at how we can take that resilience issue and address it and make it better. And that led to things, particularly in relation to storage, battery storage coming in to support network resilience. And it's now stabilized very significantly. So there is a very good technical solution for localized renewable energy generation going to grid. But where grids are less resilient and local networks are less resilient, there will be a need to have grid upgrades, and particularly in elderly grids, as we have in the UK, that we're finding that the grid upgrades are not keeping pace with the renewable developments. So it's one slowing the other down. And that's the case across Europe as well, in many cases. So current position now, that's a little bit of a history, I guess, but the current position now is that we've moved significantly to offshore wind in Europe. So onshore wind, offshore wind, solar storage are the current focus of renewable energy developments. We are working a lot in marine tidal because we're an island nation. Portugal is also looking at similar. Brittany coast, France is looking at it, and in the Baltic Straits they're looking at marine tidal also. So these things should not be counted out, because marine tidal is a very strong, always-on technology, because marine tidal always generates. It's not like wind with intermittency, so it's a more resilient source of power. The cost is a factor here, and people should be aware that renewable sources always carry a double cost. So if you build a wind farm, you also have to have a gas plant to back it up, because the wind doesn't always blow. So when you're looking at benefits of this, then you have to take that into consideration. What's happened generally across Europe is governments have given massive subsidies to get wind farms, particularly offshore wind farms, built, and that's meant that gas and hydrocarbon producers fossil fuel generators quite like that because they get to build their gas plants, they get to produce power using gas as well, which I don't have a strong view about, but it's just the way that the industry is developing. We're now seeing quite a lot of reaction. I don't know if you guys are seeing this in your jurisdictions, but we're seeing in Western Europe quite a lot of reaction to onshore wind. A lot of the planning, the NIMBY, not in my backyard type approach is starting to become prevalent. Just yesterday in the UK, the government was defeated, had to withdraw a bill proposing that they would remove restrictions on building onshore wind farms. So that they had to pull that completely. So the restrictions that were in place on onshore wind for planning purposes will remain in place in the UK. And my expectation is in places like Holland, Belgium, coastal areas of Germany, Portugal, France, etc., that will remain the case, that there will be no planning change to improve accessibility for development of onshore wind, not offshore wind, onshore wind. But those coastal areas are very much against onshore wind for reasons which are hopefully reasonably obvious for logic of putting it offshore. We're also seeing solar becoming prevalent with battery storage. We have, I think, 15 solar battery storage projects on at the moment. And across different jurisdictions, and it is quite incredible how much it has become commoditized. It is now effectively, this is what you do. You know, there's no real challenge for the lawyers anymore. It's all done. It's just doing the same documents over again, which sometimes gets a bit boring in my mind, but others might enjoy it. The advent of hydrogen production. This is quite difficult because everyone thinks that you can make hydrogen, green hydrogen, from renewable energy, and that's not, I emphasize, not the case. Two problems arise. One is you have the high cost of renewable energy, but you also have to have high power output and high temperature output to successfully make green hydrogen. You can use renewables to convert ammonia into hydrogen, but not the initial process of converting into ammonia for the hydrogen production. So there is a technical issue there, which is being worked on and hopefully will be resolved. One of the things I wanted to pick up here is that the power generation from fossil fuel generation is still increasing across the world. Everybody thinks it's decreasing. It's not really. It's still going up because the demand is still there. And so there is an interest in looking at combined solutions. And when I say combined solutions, I mean, as you guys were talking about, taking the coal, which is coal and biomass, the two most polluting methods of power production, apart from heavy oil, at the moment. So when I say combined solutions, I mean looking at attenuated gas supplies with controlled emissions, and that seems to me to be the best way of looking at the picture in the short term, at least. And I'll come on to that when we look at hubs and energy hubs in a minute. One point that you should all, I think, be aware of is that the price of electricity is directly linked to the price of oil. It's not distinct markets. We live in a world where the price of oil dictates the price of gas, which dictates the price of electricity. Until that barrier is broken, that chain is broken, we're always going to be linking electricity prices to the price of oil. So it is a problem, but I think it's something that will take more than a seminar and a Thursday morning to solve. So I'm not going to go into the detail. So just want to touch very briefly on a few project structures, because this is quite important. When we're looking at emerging markets or new markets or how people are going, and you guys have touched on this about, particularly in relation to funding and development and the complexities of going through the consenting process. So a lot of the structures, I'm going to talk probably about three structures, but all of the problems arise in the same way. It's always the land, the planning, the consenting, and the purchase, the offtake purchase agreement. And sometimes they're in different orders in different jurisdictions, but those are the four key things. So the first structure that that we see normally arising is, and we've just done this for a major developer, is an on-balance sheet development utilizing four banks, in this particular case, four banks sitting behind the balance sheet of the developer, coming in, providing effectively balance sheet funding through loan, securitized loan. And then basically what they do is they say to an EPC contractor, okay, we have this piece of land. In this case, it was a big multinational company which had a large brownfield site in Europe. They basically said, come along, we've got the funding. Can you, as an EPC contractor, design and build this plant for us and put it up and operate it? And that's exactly what happened. They just basically contracted out the delivery and operation, and they just sell the power into the grid. So there's a few legal niceties in there that you have to be aware of, that the banks will want to sign off on all the documents. They'll want warranties, they'll want performance bonds, warranty bonds, etc. Equipment warranties, you need to be really careful about this, particularly in solar projects and wind projects. So the warranties on vanes, the rotating propellers on wind farms are notoriously difficult to get. And warranties on solar panels, you have to be really careful about, because the warranties tend to be only related to the panel that is sold into the project. What you actually want is a warranty that the panel that is being sold into the project is the one that is needed for the project, not one that the vendor or the manufacturer wants to give to the project. And we have two projects in the Middle East where Chinese panels have been delivered to the project, and they've not been to the specification that has been required in the project because it's old stock, basically. And so things like that you need to be really alert to. And the same thing applies on switchgear, substation technology, etc., to get things done. Very quickly, unfunded developer. So the first one's a funded developer, the second one's the unfunded developer. This is effectively the entrepreneurial developer who goes along, gets an option over land or joint ventures with a landowner to build a project on their land. They will typically fund out of their own pockets the initial stages. They will get the land agreements, the sometimes power purchase agreements. They'll get initial consents, and then once they've done that, and this is very typical in the Middle East and North Africa, that they will then go to a joint venture with another entity who is either a developer or an EPC, a DBOM contractor, and they will sell their project in part to them and give them control, but they'll retain the equity. So they get two things. One is they get a lump of money up front when they sell the equity, and then they get a long-term return on the remaining equity they retain in the project. And a lot of these early-stage developers in northern Germany and in the Middle East followed that model, and they have made a lot of money doing that, because the rates for power purchase agreements out of these contracts when there was tariffs tariff support were very substantially above market. So it was quite an interesting exercise going through some of those. But in essence, this is an SPV vehicle created by an entrepreneurial developer who then just sells it on in whole or in part to another developer who comes in as a joint venture partner into that SPV. This one for me was always the most interesting. So I've worked on 4 of the national initiatives in the Middle East on renewable projects. So typically these are in energy poor countries, but actually one that I worked on was in Dubai, which was by no means an energy poor country, although it's not as well off as its neighbours in Abu Dhabi, etc. So, what happens here is that the government will identify that it needs support from an international supporting bank, typically American or European based. If it's in Africa, it'll be Africa, South America, the Inter-American Development Bank. And the Inter-American Development Bank's been very active in South America. We've worked with them on a couple of projects. But the main one that we've worked with in Europe is EBRD. And that I think, and the EIB have been active as well. But the EBRD are really focused on making the energy markets consistent with the energy outputs consistent with the objectives of the European Union. So it doesn't matter whether it's within Europe or abroad, they will help support in whatever way they can. And so when you're finding difficulty in funding locally, it may be worth looking at whether EBRD or EIB or other EU institutions would come in for funding, because once you get them involved, the local banks tend to fall in behind, because they get the security of having EBRD due diligence on a project to rely on. These national initiatives are usually large-scale sites. So in Jordan, the Ma'an project was 1,000 megawatts. In Dubai, it was the same size. For the first project in the Emirates was 1,000 megawatts, and then Bin Ban was 1,200 megawatts, and they've just announced phase 2 in Egypt, which is I think that's 2.4 gigawatts of 2,400 megawatts. So they're big projects over large areas of land, and generally you're given a government offtake agreement underwritten by the government, which gives you the security and funding. EBRD or one of the institutional funders will come in behind, and you get a relatively easy ride through the process, because you're working with big multinational institutions who know how to get these projects across the line. It's usually a public bidding process initially to get down selected. But once you're successful in getting through that process, you really follow a pattern. You get on a conveyor belt effectively, and it just takes you through, because the institutional funders take you through the process quite well. So the fourth one is a slightly different approach, and this is hubs, because this is what's happening now in Europe, Western Europe, and the UK. We are seeing hubs developing, and this is because of the maturity of the technologies involved. It's a recognition of market changes. It's a recognition of moving away from national grid transmission with big centralized power stations transmitting power across huge grid networks, to decentralized power generation working within networks, local networks. And because of the risk to the local networks out of renewable intermittency, they're building in new resilience. So they're upgrading networks, but they're also creating hubs which help create resilience in the local networks. And that's what that means, is it's bringing technologies together, so you get more capability of maintaining power on by having a hub which has 3 or 4 different technologies working within it. And the more recent hub initiatives are looking at 24/7 power on capability with instant battery backup to supply. The difficulty is, as lawyers, it's great for us, because these new hub initiatives have a lot of more legal issues, because you have multiple operators within the same site, you've got different licensed technologies, you've got different outputs, you've got different impacts on the user system. So this is just what the hubs look like. This is just some sketches I've taken from different presentations. So this one looks at gas grid, and so one's gas, solar, the other's grid intake, and then the other is PV and wind. And it sort of gives you an idea of supplying out to different different outputs. I don't think it's a particularly great sketch. I don't know why I put it in, to be honest, but it's it's because of the hydrogen output to vehicles, which is quite a significant one. So the bottom part is EV to vehicles, and the middle, the second one up, is a hydrogen supply into vehicles, and that becomes a hub hydrogen supply point as well. This one just, the point of this one is really just to show that the objective of hubs is to cut down CO2. It should be an objective of utilizing energy hubs to the electricity produced is at much lower CO2 levels. And then this is just another iteration of the same thing. It's just nice pictures, really. So optimization of energy technologies by collaboration, evolution of technology, so research and development opportunities for integration, development of instrumentation and control to minimize network and grid impacts, and connections, corporate PPAs, and sleeving of supply going out of hubs. It's a very, very common theme at the moment. We're working on one big project in the northeast of England where sleeving, which had gone out of fashion a little bit over the last few years because of the focus on other things, is coming back in, and it's an industrial park where all of the users are sleeved suppliers. That means that it's network supply to them, but all managed by a central body within the industrial park, which is makes everything a lot easier for them just to plug and play on what their industrial development looks like. A network PPA, that's the same idea as a sleeving. Heat output, steam for industrial purposes, and hydrogen are all parts of the hub outputs. So you have storage, which backs everything up, but you've got power, heat, steam, and hydrogen as potential outputs from hub generation centers. So I think that the ideas are growing very quickly, and they're getting merged very quickly, and we're seeing that moving forward very quickly, particularly in the UK. There's carbon credit benefits and grant funding for infrastructure improvement across all of Europe, actually. So there is quite a big initiative on energy hubs going through. So these are just nice photographs of what's available in terms of generation. I've included nuclear in this because my view is that nuclear is as clean a source of energy as any other. So now what I want to move on to is the 2014 directive on European energy security and that strategy, because in May this year, sorry about the typo in the top there, it should be capitalized May 22, the European Commission presented the REPowerEU plan, and that was intended to rapidly reduce dependence on Russian fossil fuels. But everybody thinks that where we are now in this crisis is because of the war in Ukraine. My view on that is a little bit different. So let me just explain what I think the background to this really is. So starting point is to recognize that there is an internal EU energy market. And so the EU energy market is organized and managed by the regulations imposed by the EU, and everyone that participates in that market, whether they're an accession country or a member country, has to work in accordance with those internal EU energy market rules. However, the rules don't dictate what each country's energy mix should be. So it creates a problem when you're looking at what is now under the taxonomy of clean energy in the EU, if you don't have a requirement that the electricity or energy that's being supplied into the internal energy market of the EU is generated as clean energy, then you have a major problem. And the EU are currently, or were at the end of last year, starting to look at that as a challenge. At the end of last year, the EU recognized that the wholesale prices of oil, gas, and electricity were escalating significantly. So this is before Ukraine happened. The driver behind that was the surge in global energy demand. As countries came out of COVID-19 pandemic restrictions, there was a massive uptake in power consumption across the world, not just in Europe, but it happened everywhere. And that led to a very tight supply because there was a backlog of depressed supply, and then there was a very tight supply, which led to lower volumes of natural gas imports into Europe. There was a combination of low gas supplies. In that preceding winter, there had been a very long heating requirement because it was a cold winter for longer, an unfavorable weather season, and so the weather conditions didn't favor production of renewable energy. So there was a big demand on fossil gas, particularly. Another contributing factor to that price increase was there was a very significant increase because of the climate change pressure on emissions trading systems and carbon pricing. So carbon price went up, and so all of the market reacted in a way which, from the beginning of the demand that's coming out of COVID, the whole market pushed the price up. And then, of course, on 24th of February this year, we had the invasion of Ukraine, and the EU reacted as most European countries did in a knee-jerk sort of reaction to that. And so from the end of last year, there was a series of activities from October about tackling energy prices. There was then a sort of let's draft a repowering the EU thing, which was then released and presented to the Parliament on the 18th of May this year. In June, they adopted the gas storage regulation, Regulation 1032, which was intended to help improve gas storage capability within Europe. And then in July, they announced there was a big initiative being released by the EU for Save Gas for a Safe Winter, and that sort of has continued to be the theme. What they then did in August was they said, okay, we're going to have a coordinated demand reduction program. And that was issued under an EU regulation 1369, which means that it's mandatory for every country in Europe to have a demand reduction policy and strategy in place. So what, and just following on from that, I'll just finish very quickly on the other things that happened. So there's an adoption of a regulated intervention on high energy prices. That was EU Regulation 1854. And then there was additional proposals to fight high energy prices. And at the beginning of this month, the proposal for emergency regulation to accelerate deployment of renewables, which is the whole point of me going through all this history, is that they've realized that they have to actually subsidize and accelerate deployment of renewables if they're going to avoid returning to dependency on fossil fuels. So on the 22nd, 2 days ago, they introduced a proposal for a market correction, and that market correction is intended to move the whole of the EU market towards renewable energy production. So basically, that's a sort of very long-winded lawyerish way of saying the EU have moved from being a little bit sleepy at the end of last year to taking a stance in May this year that they are going to repower Europe utilizing non-fossil fuel generation, and they will they've now announced 2 days ago that they're going to accelerate that plan by deployment of or supporting the deployment of renewable energy across the EU and accession countries and other countries that feed into the European market. So what does all of that mean from a lawyer's point of view? My take on it is, and this isn't just me that's saying this, the economists have said this as well, is that the most significant threat to national economies within Europe is the energy market, not just within Europe, actually internationally, but in particular in Europe. It is energy, which means that the energy markets, energy infrastructure, energy production within Europe have to be looked at very differently. And that is part of this acceleration program that's being brought in. This is a long read, so just take it away and read it. Basically, what it's trying to tell you is in 2014, when 0330 was issued as a regulation, as a renewable energy policy, we at that time had a cost of imported fossil fuels of 30 billion a year in Europe. At that time, UK was still a part of the EU, so we were part of that figure. That hasn't really changed very much. We're importing from different places, but we're not really replacing fossil fuel generation at the rate that's required. And they're now saying that they're going to miss the 2030 target, which was 27%. And out of COP27 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, last weekend, they made the announcement. There's now going to be tax on, or some sort of tax on fossil fuel production, which I think is a completely retrograde approach to trying to solve the energy crisis, because all that they're really doing is taking cash out of the system to support third-party countries to support their infrastructure or whatever. And I think there is going to be some real difficulty in trying to implement that decision of COP27. So my job here was to give you an overview of Europe and what's happening in Europe in the energy sector, and particularly in the renewable energy sector. I hope that's given you flavour of very quick. I realise I've been speaking very quickly, but hopefully that has given you a flavour of what we are looking at. And I'll hand back to Joanna.
Okay, we can now start with the Q&A part. Please feel free to ask questions, and we will do our best to clarify any confusion you might have. I will allow you all to your microphones, so please proceed. Okay, if we don't have any questions, I would like to thank you all one more time in front of SELA for joining us today. and I wish you a pleasant and a productive rest of the day. Please feel free to contact us directly should you have any questions. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Jovana, and all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Mhm.